Perfect. So, now that we're all here, I've done a brief introduction for you all, but if you could just start off, all three of you work in very different capacities, kind of across the humanitarian sector. Could you start off by telling us a bit more about exactly what you do and how you aid refugees? And if we start with Robert, because you're on the screen currently, and then Maha, and then Nadine.
Sure. Well, I mean, I probably can't give you an exhaustive list of our engagements, but I mean, the summary being, I guess, I work for UN Habitat, which is the Human Settlements Agency. So we started off working mostly on housing, basic services, to a certain extent, kind of broad physical infrastructure of towns and cities and that sort of thing. We come into the question of refugees from a few different angles, partly the question of host cities and host communities and the facilities and support that are required to assist with that. We also are looking at the housing, land and property rights of refugees and IDPs in their home locations and how those can be protected during the periods that they're displaced. We're also tending to look at some of the questions around social services provision and that sort of thing as well, although that is a little bit more on the edge of our kind of work. And then where refugees and IDPs are involved with becoming sort of part of other kinds of vulnerable communities, for example, slum communities, minority communities, these kinds of things, we tend to be concerned about that as well. The range of what we do, the basic two areas are policy advice and technical assistance. So policy advice, we're working with member states and with local governments quite a lot of the time on what are the right policy approaches and what are the different tools that they can use to handle the challenges they face. How can we mobilize more resources for addressing the different issues that they need to deal with? And the technical assistance is where we will have people on the ground. So, for example, you know, we're at the moment, what are we doing? A good example might be we're working with Syrian communities in Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, other places on documenting their housing, land and property rights back in Syria, and then negotiating with the Syrian authorities of what kind of recognition that we can get around that and what sorts of protections. This week I've been in the Human Rights Council, where so far the discussion has been fairly dominated by the questions of Ukraine, but we're also expecting next week to have a lot of issues around vulnerable communities in the post-COVID-19 era. And also a lot of questions about how do we provide adequate housing and adequate basic services for all. So I guess that's an attempt at the not too long summary. Thank you.
No, that's brilliant, thank you. I can't wait to expand a bit more on exactly what you do and why. Should we have Maha, if you can explain kind of what your role is?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a human rights barrister. I am one of those activist lawyers, so labelled by Priti Patel. I provide legal assistance and representation in court to refugees and asylum seekers. I've got predominantly a legal aid practice, which means that I deal with I have a lot of vulnerable clients, and they could include victims of torture, victims of trafficking. So I have a very emotionally potent caseload. That's in a nutshell, that's what I do. And I'm currently at Garden Court Chambers.
Perfect, thank you. And Nadine, do you want to tell us a bit about Ethnovision and what the organisation does?
Sure. My name's Nadine Helajzen. So my background is I'm an anthropologist and photojournalist. And for the last 20 odd years, I've been supporting vulnerable communities in post-conflict societies. My father was a stateless political refugee from the former Yugoslavia, so I'm particularly interested in this experiences of intergenerational trauma that sort of passes down through the family and can speak firsthand of that. In early 2015, I repatriated back from, I was in Australia at that time, but I returned to the former Yugoslavia, to Belgrade, actually to Sarajevo first and then Belgrade, where I founded this organisation, Ethnovision, slightly before the crisis really started picking up. So in the beginning, we were really set up to start providing comprehensive medical and protection support. There were very large numbers travelling the Western Balkans route at that time. Around 7,000 to 8,000 people a day were coming in. So we had mobilised teams of people at border areas, travelling on trains, and also in city centres where refugees were congregating and sleeping rough. And we did this for a period of about 2 years with teams working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And it was really challenging, you know, because it was, I think, the first time that there was such a refugee crisis that was moving. So it was a little bit different to providing support where people are encamped. And often people were travelling so fast that, you know, you really had to get on the train with them and provide support. Because they didn't have time to engage with you. So in 2018, when the emergency was declared over, a lot of the donors left the region, and we really had to pivot. So now we sort of re-strategized and we focus on both providing protection and legal information to people transiting through, but also documenting refugee stories. And we do this in narrative form and photographic form. So, you know, hopefully they have some documentation of proof of their story. So when they get to their destination country, they can try to use that to seek asylum.
That's brilliant, thank you. All three of you do such important roles within this sector and obviously have quite like a wide range of practical help for refugees. At SolidariTee, we talk a lot about sustainable aid, not just legal aid, because we want to make like a long-lasting impact. And I'm going to ask each of you kind of why you decided to do this specific type of aid. If we start with you, Nadine.
Well, you know, it was a pragmatic decision, I suppose. Like in the beginning, when we had the mobilised teams providing support, that's what was most needed. And again, you know, when we had to sort of re-strategise and fine-tune our operations, this was something that the beneficiaries themselves expressed that they needed. And I think when we talk about sustainable aid, that's one of the most important things, is that we need to design programs in partnership with the beneficiaries of those programs, because too often organisations take this top-down approach, providing what they believe that people need, and there was a huge amount of wastage during this crisis because of that. I think there's still a warehouse in Belgrade that's filled with baby carriers, you know, because for some reason everybody was donating that, thinking that's what was needed. So I think that's one of the most important things, and that's one of the principles that we follow at Ethnovision.
That's brilliant. And Maha, if you want to kind of follow on from that, obviously you both work in different regions, so if you could kind of talk a bit about that.
Sure. Sorry, you're cutting out a bit, but I think I understood what you said. So I'm a natural empath, and so I chose to work in the area of human rights because I guess it's because it's people focused, and it's an area of law where you can really make a fundamental difference in someone's life. And in the area of refugee law, it can translate to literally mean the difference between life and death. And so for that reason, it remains for me one of the most rewarding areas of practice as a barrister. And legal aid is vital to my clients because it provides access to justice for the most vulnerable people. I think, to put it simply, exclusion of legal aid is exclusion to sort of social justice, basically, or access to social justice. Is as simple as that. It can make the difference between winning or losing a case. So it's really important that my very vulnerable clients have access to proper, good quality legal representation early on in the start of their journey in the UK in terms of the legal process. They've already got so many things that they're trying to navigate, as well as the trauma that they bring with them, not just because of the journey, but because of what's happened to them in their home country. And then they come to the UK and they're dealing with the barrage of information, and processes and procedures that are just new to them. So access to legal aid is vital because, as I said, it's access to justice. It means that they have the best chance of winning their claims, and if not their claims, then certainly their appeals, which is where I come in as a barrister. So I come in at the point where the Home Office refuse an asylum seeker's refugee claim. And then I represent them at the appeal stage before an immigration tribunal to try and have that sort of overturned. So have an independent immigration judge allow their asylum appeal. So for me, it's very important that my clients have access to legal aid because, of course, it's means tested, but of course, a lot of my clients can't afford legal representation, and they deserve the right to be represented in court.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because both of you kind of do the very practical work that is needed in those specific areas, like in the UK. But Robert, you work kind of internationally with UN Habitat. Can you talk a bit about why housing and shelter is so important in the international context?
I suppose this operates on a few different levels. I would start with the basics of just the UN Charter, which I know very often the UN is much maligned, but I think some of the original ideas have stood the test of time. But I mean, the basic three pillars of the UN are, on the one hand, peace and security, and then the idea that you will never achieve peace and security if you don't have economic development and you don't have respect for human rights. So I think that's where we start, that everybody deserves peace and security, and they need to be given the opportunities for economic development and the protection of their rights that will allow them to have peace and security. And that's both at an individual and at a collective level. So I think that's one of the reasons why we do what we do. As Habitat, we first got sort of, our predecessors were first created in response to two things, one of which was World War II, and the other one was the round of independence in the sort of late 50s, early 60s, and a lot of newly independent states that were often coming from a fairly discriminatory history, and so had a large amount of their population who were very, very short on basic needs and basic issues. And then over the years, conflict is always a concern. We are not, as the UN, very often the quickest or the cheapest solution for everything. We tend to be relatively slow and a little bit clumsy, and our processes tend to be more expensive than the average. But what we can do is keep open channels direct to governments, and we can sometimes get into places that other people can't. Some of the things that we were able to do in northern Iraq, not necessarily while IS was active, but very soon after them moving out of areas, we were able to get in quicker than some other organizations would be able to, simply because of the political cover that we had and that sort of thing. But I think the other thing is that a lot of states, even though the public will and sometimes even the political will might be there, a lot of states need a bit of nudging to do what one might call the right thing. And I think having the UN Secretariat and having other states look at having them look at what each other are doing, it's not perfect, but it's an encouragement towards slightly better behavior and taking the edge off some of the worst behavior. For example, the UN Special Rapporteur on Adequate Housing has queried the UK on the state of housing in the UK for the poor, and there have also been questions on the status of refugees and things like that. And the UK has to answer to those. They feel, for various reasons, obliged to. And the fact that a state has to answer the questions at least means that you open them up to a bit of scrutiny, and hopefully you can move things forward. So we don't necessarily deal with the most dramatic processes of all time, but I think it's to do with getting long-term systemic change and making sure that everybody can have their dignity respected. And the rules of asylum, I mean, international humanitarian law is very clear. Everybody has a right to asylum. That is not a negotiable thing. It's not up to a state to decide, I'm going to do this because I feel like it or not. It's a right. And we need to make sure that states live up to that. They promised that they will. They should. Over.
I think it's really interesting that all three of you kind of picked up on this, doing the right thing, and kind of everyone deserves access to legal aid and safe housing. And I think it's just really important that that kind of motivates you all. And we're all obviously talking about kind of long-term change. You've all worked in these sectors for kind of the duration of the so-called refugee crisis. And I was wondering if you have seen as big of a change as people sometimes kind of attribute to it. Robert, if we kind of start with you with that.
No, I guess this is possibly not with my official hat on, but I would probably say no. I think in general terms, well, actually, it depends who you're talking about. If you're talking about governments, I don't think there's been a fundamental change. I think they still tend to react to circumstances. I think there are some who have been exceptions, but that is very much subject to the political winds. I think the current experience with what is emerging with Ukraine, to a certain degree, while the response has been very positive, I think just goes to show that if something hits the headlines and grabs the public attention, then governments will think, oh, I need to respond. They don't necessarily do it all. I think the UK government, from what I see in the news, seems to be fairly reactive rather than proactive on a lot of these things at the moment. They're being pushed to do the right thing. They're letting it happen, so that's good, and they should be congratulated, but they're not really out front leading the charge. So I don't think things have changed in that regard, but I think what has changed is the way the public engage, and I think this is true in so many different fields, but the ready access to information that the public has through social media and through the digital world means that people know much quicker what's going on, who's moving where, what the scale of a crisis may be, and public demand for change comes much quicker than it used to. Governments used to be able to lock these things away in a corner and say, it's up to us, let us get on with it. They can't do that anymore, at least not very readily. So I think that does change the equation to some degree, but it makes activism a lot easier. And I wasn't joking when Maha made the point about activist lawyer. I think to a certain degree, activist is becoming a badge of honor, really, in that we've seen a number of cases, you know, even in the extremes of war now, where citizen activity is changing outcomes. People go out and say, I'm not going to put up with this. I want it to be a different way. I thought it was wonderful, some of the cases we saw in Glasgow, where people said, no, refugees and asylum seekers are part of our community, and we will not let them be taken away. That kind of thing, I think, has been a big change, and I hope that that stays and spreads and continues. Over.
Yeah, I think that's really insightful. Thank you. Maha or Nadine, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, there are two things. First of all, from a practitioner's point of view, so in the legal aid context, a lot has changed, and that's just a direct result of the cuts that we're experiencing, the constant cuts that we're experiencing to legal aid over the last few years. And that not only affects the recipients of legal aid, but it also affects those representing them. A colleague of mine, Joe Wilding from Garden Court Chambers, has written extensively on legal aid. And if you're interested in legal aid and sort of technical details and processes and procedures, then you should read up on her stuff. But I just want to quote something from her. She's written a book about legal aid, but also she's written a report that was published in 2019. And effectively, the report highlights that when considering a three-part relationship of a working market of legal aid provision, so that's financial viability, quality of work, and access for potential clients, it's only ever possible for practitioners to manage two of the three. So providers that have tried to provide a high quality of work for a high volume of clients have gone out of business. Providers that wish to provide high quality of work and remain afloat have had to limit their client intake. And providers behaving in an economically rational way in this context and not limiting access to potential clients are extremely unlikely to be providing high quality advice and representation. So in other words, you can't have all three. And actually in my professional career, I have experienced firsthand what that can look like. So I used to work for a really amazing organisation called Refugee and Migrant Justice, which as a direct result of the legal aid cuts went into administration whilst I was still working there. So we were told that we had 10 days to shift. I think at that time we had 10,000 clients, we had 13 regional offices and 270 staff. In 10 days, we were told we were going into administration and all these poor clients had to be shifted off to other legal aid solicitors. So I have witnessed and experienced firsthand what that can mean in terms of, the drastic results of cuts to the legal aid sector. And unfortunately, I'm not very sanguine about the future in terms of structurally, things are just getting worse in terms of legal aid. But I do share optimism, the optimism that Robert was expressing earlier about activists and people being proactive in representing refugees, and I don't mean just legally, sort of representing them as people, and just speaking out for refugees. And I think we need to really acknowledge the immense contribution that refugees can make to host countries. And again, touching on what Robert said earlier, we also need to emphasize the need for international cooperation, that refugees are a collective global responsibility, not just the responsibility of some states over the other. And we really need to move away from this idea of criminalizing asylum seekers and dehumanizing them, And unfortunately for immigration and asylum lawyers at the moment, it's a very difficult time. It's a real hostile time to be an immigration and asylum lawyer. We have, the National and Borders Bill 2021 is soon, it is going through Parliament. And that's been described by some human rights lawyers as the biggest legal assault on international refugee law ever seen in the UK. So in some ways, I'm hopeful and optimistic about the future, but in other ways, I'm not so sanguine because the government are increasingly sort of criminalizing refugees, both legally and administratively, through through things like the National and Borders Bill, which is hopefully which we're trying to sort of challenge and oppose in terms of highlight the injustices that are inherent in the bill.
Can I just add something quickly there? I think it's extremely important to remember that what Maha is talking about is not just about lawyers and their clients, however important that may be. If you don't have a proper functioning legal aid system and people cannot protect their rights, you don't have rule of law. And it doesn't matter whether they're citizens or not, or where they came from. Everybody who is resident in your country should have a set of rights that we universally recognize, that the government will respect and honor, and that they can protect. And lawyers should be able to fight that, as Maha was saying earlier, to the maximum quality possible. If you don't have that, the whole structure of your system is questionable, and you, as the rest of the citizens who think, well, I'm not a refugee, so it doesn't matter to me. Yeah, but you don't really know, because it comes into a question of if some people's rights are negotiable, then maybe everybody's are. And one needs to be quite careful about those things. Over.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, kind of the this idea that, you know, everybody could potentially be a refugee, and we're seeing that with Ukraine at the moment. Just before we move on a bit, Nadine, did you have anything to add to kind of what we were just talking about?
I can add very little to what Maha and Robert have already stated. I mean, it's the same situation for us in regards to funding cuts. As soon as the emergency was declared over, you know, all the donors basically disappeared. But yet the emergency wasn't over. We still had large numbers of people travelling, but, you know, the routes went underground. They started taking different pathways as more fences were built. They were moving into Bosnia, for example, at that time. So we had the numbers, but, you know, it was constantly moving. So it wasn't sort of as visible, I suppose. Yeah, I think this crisis really is, you know, emblematic of Europe's total ambivalence and failure to manage forced migration in this present time. So instead of really collaborating to design refugee policies that are grounded in the Declaration of Human Rights and share this responsibility equally among, you know, European countries, Europe is busy building walls and fences and shutting the most vulnerable out. Now, you know, those policies don't work. The hardline policies don't work. They cause unnecessary suffering and deaths because people will flee regardless. You know, I also think that the majority of the responsibility for supporting refugees is really being placed on poorer countries, or as we call them, the global south. And, you know, to address safe passage and social policy, it's a shared responsibility of all, and that needs to be an absolute priority. And I just see this getting worse. If we talk about how things are changing, it's not getting better.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting that you've all kind of addressed these criticisms, and kind of the lack of funding has been touched on a bit. But I was going to ask you all kind of what's the biggest issue facing your work at the moment? If we start with Nadine, then Maha, then Robert, what is your biggest struggle at the moment?
Well, I think that, you know, the so-called massive numbers of refugees travelling to Europe in 2015, it really fueled this xenophobic reactions across the continent. And at the beginning of the crisis, there were also a number of events in Europe, such as the November 13 attack on Paris and the melee in Cologne. And all of that has contributed to justifying the rejection of asylum seekers, especially from Syria and the Middle East, but elsewhere as well. You know, and there remains a fear that terrorists can be travelling in the refugee columns. And so we have this distrust and hostility in Europe towards non-Europeans fleeing war and persecution. This is very much seen even, you know, in the media reporting on Ukraine. Which is quite, you know, openly racist. So, you know, and also the obstacles in Eastern European, you know, along the Eastern European routes that were really created to deter this movement of people. It produced all these dramatic images, which also fed into anxieties. So, I think, you know, there's a perception that integrating refugees into Western societies is not a possibility, or it's not compatible. So what we really need to do is change public perception, and this is extremely important and needs to be facilitated on a much bigger scale through advocacy. So that for me is a really big challenge. And we try to do that through some of our storytelling and imagery. To sensitise people, to make them better understand, you know, the backstories of refugees, why they're leaving, and you know, their hopes and dreams for the future, and just basically, you know, that they're human just like you and me, and have the same hopes and desires for the future. So I think another thing that's challenging is this, and it's connected to the public perception, but it's changing that narrative that's delivered by mainstream media around refugees, which is portraying them as these sort of hapless victims, and then conversely, the country that is going to offer them a home, you know, some sort of charitable saviour. So, you know, further work needs to be done on changing perceptions in that way. So, you know, this is extremely challenging for us.
Thank you. Before we kind of expand on that a bit, Maha and Robert, Maha and then Robert, want to kind of talk about your perception of this?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I have too much to expand on what Nadine said. She's pretty much said everything that I already feel and believe, and I've in fact already touched upon. I have a big issue about how refugees are perceived, and I think we really need to challenge that. But funding is obviously a massive issue in my field of work for the reasons I've already explained. You know, there are amazing organisations out there doing amazing, incredible work, but they're just limited in terms of resources and money. So they're not able to deliver what they would hope to deliver. And maybe this might be a good opportunity for me to talk about my app very quickly, because this, again, feeds into what Nadine was saying. So my small, tiny contribution was to develop an app. I mean, I didn't develop it. I don't know anything about tech. I joined up with this amazing, with my amazing tech partner. They're called Super Being Labs. I had the idea of developing an app for refugees. And I had the idea because over the course of many years representing refugees, I realized, of course, that although they came to me for their legal problems and challenges, that refugees faced many other challenges, and Nadine touched upon integration and the idea of integrating refugees into the UK or to the host country, and so they faced lots of barriers in terms of integrating, and a lot of the barriers was just sort of lack of information, lack of resources, and as I said, there are many amazing organisations doing really good work, but they're just limited in terms of what they can offer. And I had an idea. I thought, oh, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could empower refugees and give them the information so that they could themselves navigate through life in the UK. So I teamed up with Super Being Labs, and we've made an app now, and it's now been launched. I would say it's a sort of soft launch, and it's been given to sort of individuals and small organisations. And the app provides resources, tools, and information for refugees to enable them to integrate into society, to become fully functioning members of society. So, for example, at what age do your children go to school? What do you have to do? How do you set up a bank account? I mean, those basic things that people need to be, as I said, fully functioning members of society. And it was just such a nice thing to be able to, think about ways to empower refugees, because as Nadine said, we often have this idea of, maybe they're not as educated as us or sophisticated as us. There's really, awful sort of stereotypes that we have. And of course, if we look at
not true.
Absolutely not true. And we really need to dispel. We really need to, work towards dispelling these, horrible stereotypes that we have, and start humanizing refugees. And just give individuals, like I said, empower individuals themselves to be able to navigate what is, quite a difficult system in terms of trying to rebuild their lives in the UK. So that's what my app hopes to do. And it's still at a very fledgling stage. So as I said, we've only my tech partner have only sort of given it to a very few choice individuals and organizations. And I should say that the app was built for refugees, but by refugees as well. So we had numerous workshops with refugees, to ask them what would they need. Some of them, further on in their journey, some of them fairly early on in their journey of integration into the UK, to ask, what would they need to be able to feel like that they can, function better and have all the resources that they would need.
Yeah, that's really amazing. Thank you. I think it's really important that you both kind of touched on integration and kind of public perception. Robert, do you have anything to kind of add on to this?
Well, I certainly agree with what's been said before, and I like the idea of that app as well. I mean, please, Maha, if there is any information available on that, that would be very useful. I would love to share that with some other colleagues as well.
Thank you.
I think the problem is what do I put my finger on as the entry point for some of this? I mean, there's the dreamy side of me that says I would love to see more political will and more political consistency, because it frustrates me a lot of the time that we keep having to discuss again and again issues that shouldn't be up for discussion. Governments have a set of obligations that they are meant to fulfill no matter what. They've signed up to that. They've been signed up to it for, 80 odd years now.
Yeah.
We shouldn't have to keep fighting that again and again and again. And that should then translate through into budgetary commitments for the states that are able. It should also mean that some of the sort of more complex and challenging regulations should be reviewed to make the situation easier. But that may be too optimistic. And I guess the biggest thing short of that I wish I could see would be a kind of flattening out of the funding cycle in a way, in terms of, as the other two speakers have highlighted, we are definitely in a trough at the moment. There is a lot of funding is down for all kinds of areas, really. In my world, a lot of what used to be done quite multilaterally and cooperatively amongst states has become very bilateral and individualistic. Countries want to stick their label on it and say, I did this. They don't really want to work together as much as they did. And that means that, for 4, if you're lucky, 5 or 6 years, you might get quite good funding for something. And then, our priorities have changed. We're not going to fund that anymore. And you have to shut down and start all over again. That's a very difficult thing. I mean, I think you can tell from what Maha is discussing. An immigration lawyer is not a supply that you can switch on and off. It takes a lot of experience and training to do this well. You need a consistently available body of people. The same with Diane's organization. It's not something you can just turn on and off. It's accumulated experience, knowledge, and skill. And that requires long-term funding, not the 2-3 year cycles. I mean, frequently we're having to manage even I don't know, particularly within the UN, on 12-month or less cycles. I can barely hire somebody in 12 months with our bureaucracy. So by the time I've hired someone, the funding's run out. It's a crazy way of doing things. And I think if that could be stabilized around some kind of greater recognition that there needs to be a consistent treatment and approach, then that would help significantly. And surely within, I suppose I shouldn't be saying this in a British forum to a British audience at the moment, but surely that can be done on a European level, because clearly the scale of the issue is a European question. And it's all interrelated. What happens in one country has a direct knock-on impact on what happens in another. Over.
Thank you. I think this kind of brings me on to the next question. You've obviously all said that kind of these major issues of funding, public perception, integration, kind of will to do things. But what do you see as the future of sustainable aid? Kind of your hopes, but also your practical beliefs on what it's going to become? Robert, if we maybe start with you.
I think I would pick on 2 particular things, which might be a little quirky. One of them, I would say I would like to see, while the question of guarantees and things like that has to function at the national level, I would like to see a lot more discussion of localization of a lot of the service provision and this kinds of thing, so that we can strengthen the kind of community-based approaches to a lot of this, because there's a lot of, in many, many countries, there are a lot of host communities who've shown themselves to be absolutely incredible hosts. And with a bit more support and a bit more assistance, they really could keep that going on a consistent basis over time. So I think I would definitely like to see that. I did have another one, but it's completely gone now, and I'm sure it probably can't have been that vital. But yeah, that localization of it would really make a lot of difference for me. And then I suppose for sustainability, sorry, it's come back to me now. What I was thinking about is, you could, of course, with a refugee or an asylum seeker, one of the cardinal rules is they make their choices. You don't make their choices for them. They should not be forced into situations that they do not want to be in. And within that scope, making sure that they've got a real range of choices about what their future means. Give them the option of fully integrating into their host community where they end up, if that's what they want to do. But wherever possible, provide support that if they want to return to their point of origin when the circumstances are right, that they have some guarantees and assistance around doing that. But obviously that comes with a very, very heavy caveat that it must not be abused and people must not be forced into situations that they don't want to be in. Over.
Thank you. I think the kind of idea of refugee autonomy and individual autonomy is really important.
Also to remove the burden from, the idea of a refugee is not a forever public burden. These are productive members of society. If you give them the opportunity, they will more than pay for any costs that they impose. Usually most immigrants create a net tax benefit for their host countries. These are not people who are a burden on society. Give them the opportunity, allow them to integrate, and then you won't have to think about, can we afford this or not? Over.
Thank you. I think that really nicely culminates kind of these themes that we've been talking about. Maha, do you have anything to add to kind of how you see the future?
Again, just in the context of legal aid, at the moment, what we have in terms of the legal aid structure is a very rigid system. So there's fixed fees and very low pay for legal aid practitioners. And I think the whole system just needs to be simplified and made easier in terms of who is eligible. And they should have access early on to legal aid and to the resources that they need. And we need to remove these so-called legal aid deserts. In terms of geography in the UK, it's not sort of equitable. So there are areas in the UK where some refugees just don't have access to the resources, don't have access to housing, to community care, to legal aid providers, and that's why they're called legal aid deserts, because there's literally nothing there for them. And so they let's just say, for example, their point of arrival is London, so they end up in London, but then they eventually get dispersed right outside London to other areas of the UK, and they could potentially end up in, like I said, one of these legal aid deserts where they just don't have access to anything. So we need to try and level up that sort of playing field and make sure that these legal aid deserts don't exist. And we just need generally for the legal aid system to be more flexible in terms of its funding and who it provides funding for, so that those who are very vulnerable can have access to the resources that they very much need. And I just want to echo what Robert said about this whole idea of, we really need to move away from this notion that refugees are a burden on society, and we need to acknowledge the real contribution that foreign migrants and refugees have made to the UK. I think the pandemic has uncovered some of that, in terms of, all the nurses and the doctors who are foreign nationals sort of supporting the NHS during a time when we really, really needed that support. My grandmother, unfortunately, was one of the early victims of the care home COVID scandal, where sort of no one was allowed to go in, and she died quite early on in the pandemic. And literally every single person in that care home was a foreign national or a refugee or a foreign migrant. And they were the ones looking after my grandmother, so it could not be more clear to me what the contribution is to our, to the UK. So I think we really need to sort of move on from this very sort of archaic way of thinking about, they're going to be a burden. That we need to accept that actually hosting refugees can be a very enriching experience for our society. You know, they don't detract, they add to our society in so many ways. And I think once we get over that mindset, then only then can, you know, things progress in the way that they should.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's really important to remember. And I think it's definitely key that you've all kind of pointed that out and spoken on it. So just to round off before, I think we still should have time for questions. No? Okay, just to finish off, Nadine, can you just say kind of what your hopes for the future of legal aid are? Not legal aid, sustainable aid, sorry.
I can't add too much more to what Maha and Robert have expressed already, and they put it beautifully. The localization of service provision is you know, absolutely critical to sustainability of aid, because we're the ones that are left behind at the end of the day. But you know, this is a really big issue for small domestic NGOs, that we don't have PR and marketing budgets. People don't know about us, but yet we do really, you know, high impact good work. So, you know, I would encourage people, if they want to contribute to supporting refugees, to maybe find an organisation, a small organisation that they align with, and that they could provide support to. It doesn't have to be financial, but, you know, it can be online, graphic design support. There's a whole lot of different ways that people could help. With this refugee crisis as well, back to talk about funding, you know, there was one particular donor that just monopolised the entire landscape for the European refugee crisis, and for them, they didn't have much of an understanding of the Balkans region and hadn't travelled here and weren't really providing any support because I think they thought that our region was too corrupt, and they didn't know who to trust to send money to. So basically it left all of us without any funding to provide anything, because every donor we approached, we would get referred back to that key funding bodies. So diversification of funds is really important. And I had something to add before about this sort of public perception, because in the last 9 days, there's been, you know, more than 1 million refugees coming out of Ukraine, and journalists really aren't hiding their racism anymore. I've got a couple of quotes that were in the news yesterday. I'll read them. The Bulgarian Prime Minister said, "These are not the refugees we are used to. They are Europeans, intelligent, educated people. Some are IT programmers. This is not the usual refugee wave of people with an unknown past. No European country is afraid of them." This was on the BBC. It's very emotional for me because I see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed. Another woman on CNBC, to put it bluntly, these are not refugees from Syria, these are refugees from Ukraine. They're Christian, they're white, they're very similar. So, you know, while we all have this feeling that there's discrimination and xenophobia, I think from this most recent media reportage, which was more hidden a few years ago, it's really something that we need to tackle in the future, moving forward. I think that's it, really.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That last point actually brings us on to the media panel at 3:30, if that interested you.